Kevin, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Um, and I am retired, so the introduction was very kind, but you know, those of us that have passion about workplace health tend to keep that passion no matter what transition or part of their life that they are actually in. So thank you, and I'm glad to work with Workplace Health Without Borders. This first slide, I want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due. This presentation was given by a colleague of mine, Stephen Verpele, at the International Occupational Health Association meeting this past September, so in 2018. He created this presentation and gave it as part of an educational session that I moderated. And I asked him if I asked his permission to give this presentation, and since we are colleagues on this project as well. And so you'll see my name there on the first slide, but I want to make sure that you do understand that Stephen put this together. It is about our project, and I'm very proud and pleased to be able to give this presentation to you today, but it is Stephen's work. So the Stone Crushers project, last year we wrote a grant and submitted that. I'll tell you who's on, or show you who's on the project group in just a moment, but we wrote a grant and submitted it to the Developing World Outreach Initiative in San Francisco, California, and the grant was awarded to Workplace Health Without Borders. And to let you know a little bit more about that project, the aim was to evaluate the silica exposure and ergonomic practices in the informal stone crushing work sector in Tanzania. If you're, you guys are all ahead of me, I'm sure, but the first time I heard the phrase informal work sector, I had to ask, what does that mean? Many of you may know, but in Tanzania, these are people who, and other places in the world, but I'm going to focus on Tanzania because I'll give you some percentages here in a moment. But they're not regulated because they primarily work for themselves. And in Tanzania, about 60 to 67% of the working population comprises the entire informal work sector. So in other words, many of the workers in Tanzania do not fall under any sort of regulation. Now, I want to say in one sense that's not terribly different from the United States, where if you are, a workplace has to have 10 or greater employees before they fall under the OSHA regulations. And I'm not saying that others should not comply, I'm saying simply they don't get OSHA inspections. So many of these people, if they were working in the United States for themselves, probably wouldn't be inspected by the federal OSHA anyway. But the objectives of this project was to identify the different tasks performed by the stone crushers. By the way, they're making rocks that are used in the construction industry of roads and buildings, so they're considered very important part of the work sector. And we wanted to measure the breathing zone exposure to respirable dust and silica. And following that, we wanted to inform the workers about the results and provide training and information sessions so that they could protect themselves from exposure risks. So here's the team. If you don't know me, I'm the only woman on the page, and so I was the team leader. Aristides, who's the next person in line there, he and I wrote the grant. He's the in-country project manager. He works for Acacia Mining in Tanzania. The third picture there is of my son. I mean, Galvin is a pretty unusual last name, but he is my son, and he went along as our videographer and, as Stephen said, stage manager. And then there's Stephen Verpele, the very end picture. of the BICO Center for Occupational Health. Now, he is playing an extremely important role in this project because he, as representing BICO, is providing our lab analysis and sampling equipment at no cost. And I'm going to repeat that again because BICO is the Belgian Center for Occupational Health. They have now, we now have a memorandum of understanding through WHWB and the US and UK affiliates, so that any project that those three entities put together can have their lab analysis performed at no cost. Pretty big deal. And that allowed us to keep the costs of this project down immensely. Okay, this is just a little map showing you where we all come from. And we visited the site in June of 2018, and this was our kickoff of the project. Stephen, I had equipment shipped over, and Aristides picked us up and organized meetings with different entities. Here, our first day was a meeting with Tanzania OSHA, and they asked on the spot, they being the gentleman in the center who is the Executive Director of Research and Training for OSHA, Mr. Joshua Matiko, asked that we draft a collaborative agreement to help them with a sustainable occupational health program. And I want to spend a little time talking about that because he was very interested and adamant that this not be just a one-off visit. He was very supportive of our project, but he also wanted us to help him with a sustainable occupational health program. I was very excited to hear about that. He wanted help getting his inspectors certified via OHTA training. This training is offered, one group that offers that training is WHWB. So a budget was drafted for that training, which requested 2 weeks of training, and the budget has been approved by Mr. Matiko and was accepted in December. So that's interesting and good news. We can talk about that later if you want. But day two, the project team, as I showed you, visited Muhimbili University, and I gave a presentation to students and staff about careers and general information on toxicology and industrial hygiene. It was, I'll tell you more later, the students were just awesome and in their enthusiasm and how they welcomed us. We also met with the acting dean of the School of Public Health, and he realized after a short conversation that occupational health focuses on disease prevention. And he looked at us with sort of this great recognition, and he said, that's what we have to do in this country. We have to focus on disease prevention. Spending all of our money on treating sick people is not the best use of our money. It should be spent preventing disease. So we hope in the future that we can work more with Muhimbili University. We went back to Muhimbili University the second day. I guess this would be our third day in country. And Stephen Verpele made a presentation on IH monitoring and measurements to the students and staff. It was videoed by Egan, and it was a very interactive presentation because Aristides would stand up ever so often and translate what Stephen had said. And it was great to see everyone asking questions. Some students had very good English. Others would ask, if Aristides could repeat it. I thought it was a very great interaction between students and staff, and and the presenters. We had 6 students offer to help with our project, so with the stone crushers air sampling, and 2 students requested to be mentored. Imzo was one of those students, and he is on the call. The site visit occurred the 4th day we were there. We went to the site to identify different similar exposure groups, and in addition to identify our background exposures, which interestingly occurred, or background exposures and non-worksite exposures. And I want to talk just a little bit about that, as we were watching. You know, we IHs tend to watch. I've been accused of not doing much work, but I do watch a lot. And so we were watching all the work being done, and we noticed that the sieving of the different particles, and I'll talk about that more in a moment, but the wind was carrying the dust sort of downwind, where people, young and old, had set up sort of a shade area. And it was very obvious that they were receiving some, of course we didn't quantitate it that day, but some exposure. So we were very careful to include that type of exposure in our SEGs, in our similar exposure groups, and wanted to look at that. Bulk samples were taken for further identification, and I will talk quite a bit about those today. Okay, so the tasks that were identified, excuse me, I'll direct you to the pictures on the top right. Right in the center of the left picture appears to be a tower or a rock formation. It is basically what was left from when a big digger machine went in and sort of pulled the hill down so that the workers could start breaking up the rock. There was only 1 man in the cabin of the excavator, and of course, due to the heat, the windows were open. When we were there, the excavator wasn't moving, so it was hard to judge, and there was no work going on around that, the excavator, so it would be hard for us to judge any sort of exposure, but that was one of our noted similar exposure groups. The person in the big digger machine created big rocks, and the tool, the sledgehammer, was used to make those into medium-sized rocks. Then moving down the column on the left, the medium rock was broken into smaller rocks using a small short-handled hammer, and then that small rock was bagged into heavyweight bags that weighed about 25 to 30 pounds. And I just want to point out that you can see all different sizes of rocks in the pictures. In fact, every task that's identified, I doubt that you can see. Can you see my pointer? If not,
yes, I can see it. I can see it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, everybody
else is muted. Yeah.
So you can see here the big rocks. These are actually the smaller rocks, and then here, this is just a hand-built screen where they sieve. They actually throw the rocks, the small rocks, against that screen, and then the powder material that comes out the back is used in cement making. And they had 2 different sizes of sieves. There you see one was about 1 centimeter square, and the other was much, much smaller. And this created a powder. And this is the powder, this is the material, I should say, that we saw sort of moving across to the people who were sitting in the shade that were not necessarily working. So here we have a picture of the, I believe, yes. I just wanted to let people know that this is just representative of the different samples. And throughout the strata of the rock that we saw, it changed colors. It actually sort of, if you picked it up and pressed it, it wanted to sort of hang together, but it was the dry season. It hadn't rained in a long time. So we thought possibly this is just the nature of the material itself. So there you have a view. We almost lost these in customs, but without much further ado, that we were able to get them through with Aristides' help. So if you can move to the next one, we'll show some data of what we found. Now, this is once again, and Tom, I see your question. We're going to talk about the percent silica in the bulk in just a minute, because that is a very, very important question. If you'll see here, I want you to focus on, well, X and Y. You'll see 100% cumulative on the left axis, log scale on the bottom. The blue and the red are our fractions, are the crushed stone fractions. I want you to just understand what you're seeing right now. The green triangles is not our data. It is actually what ACGIH classifies as inhalable. You see that graph. Then the X's, open X's, are the thoracic. These are all ACGIH definitions. And then the blue X with a bar through it is the respirable. So you might think, sorry, you might think just looking at this slide that, oh, we may not have anything to worry about, because the crushed stone, whether it is the powder or the coarse fraction, doesn't really seem to have much respirable silica in it. So if you can advance the slides, and what we will show you is just that part of the graph, whoops, a little too far, but just that part of the graph. On the left side, now you'll see we're only looking at 20% of the cumulative exposure for both the coarse and fine. And you'll see that 20% just starts to pick up where the respirable fraction would kick in. And you still may say, I'm not so concerned about that. We're going to let the data show us. But many of you may know that a lot of people just take bulk samples and let that guide their sampling. And so on the next slide, I'm going to answer Tom's question and show you why you should be concerned. I'm going to start by showing you, if you'll just look at the quartz and look at it all the way across, the bulk sample is only showing 2.5% quartz, but the fine powder is showing a little over 31% quartz. You might not have gotten that sort of information, as I say, if you just looked at that last graph. And what we discovered is also, if you look at calcite, so the next red number down under mineral sample, 92.1, that's probably why the stuff sort of stuck together. And it was 92% calcite, but that drops to 29.8% if you read horizontally across as the stone becomes crushed. So it's an interesting dynamic that we should all be aware of, that if you just take a bulk sample and look at the background and go, it's only 2.5% quartz, it's probably not going to be an issue. And yet, as it goes through its processing steps, the percentage of quartz, hence silica, is enhanced. So be aware of that. Okay. If you'll go to the next slide. So importantly, results cannot be used for direct personal exposure estimations. That's what I was trying to say, but it is important in the initial assessment to the mineral formation that is mainly consisting of calcite. You can identify the quartz content in the finer fraction. As we just stated, it becomes a higher percentage of quartz. And then let that drive your identification of the higher risk exposure groups, which in this case were the powder screen workers. This too will give information about the how much time you want to sample and not overload your cassettes. So take into account, of course, the limit of quantitation for your quartz analysis. But let me just repeat before we go on to one of the last slides that if you just take a bulk grab sample, don't be so certain, and look at the quartz, don't let that mislead you into thinking that you may not have any silica exposure. So one of the last lessons learned, it can take a long time to get your permits, whether it's filming permits. We never got the filming permit. It can take a long time to get sampling permits through any country's organization. The equipment was sent. It was not received while we were there. It was received shortly after we left, and it can take much longer than promised. Training and information sessions regarding the project and sampling exercise are very important, and the presence of the team in person is often required. We felt like we got a lot out of meeting with the workers and talking with the workers and telling them why we were there, even though we didn't have any results. And of course, a follow-up is needed to have all required information. If I can go to the certainly the last slide. Some of the other benefits that we weren't expecting, which was a great thing, is that in the end, we had 4 students volunteer to be part of a mentoring group from Muhimbili University. And even since then, one from Zanzibar University is now asked to join. Certainly part of the projects, we now understand what the stone crushers in Tanzania are, the different exposure groups are. And to date, 50 samples of the 150 planned samples have been taken and returned to the lab in Belgium. And the equipment has been returned to the lab and already taken to Egypt for a brick kiln project and has been used. So sample analysis is forthcoming. And with that, the last slide actually just says thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them.